times of crisis when the country goes to war, Quakers are confronted with a choice, and the choices individuals make can lead to resisting the draft, being a conscientious objector, or embracing the final dreadful alternative, war. The Quaker religion is a society of individuals whose primary belief is that there is that of God in everyone, and from this has derived the testimonies of peace, simplicity, equality, stewardship, and integrity. In the tradition of Quakerism, each person is believed capable of finding what is true, and therefore is obligated to struggle until he comes to some understanding of what is right and act as his conscience dictates. Those that choose peace are not necessarily passive in their decisions or approaches to peace, nor do they advocate passive response. They plead only thoughtfulness, and thoughtfulness, they've demonstrated, is a powerful response. While the peace testimony was strong in the years between the wars, the attack on Pearl Harbor severely tested the pacifism of many Quakers.
Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that very afternoon, I just went off by myself up into the hills. And I remember just sitting there, really agonizing. Was I really a CO? Could I continue this? Or was my loyalty to my country and all that stuff sufficient to make me change my mind? It's like Jesus. I don't compare myself to Jesus. But I went up into the hills that very day. And I came down and I had made up my mind. So I did have it wasn't a conversion. It was just but I took it seriously. And when your nation goes to war, that's a weighty matter.
The choir had just performed at Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and we were on our way home, a group of us in the car, and turned the radio on. And we were all just totally silent. And it was quite an emotional moment for us. And I don't think the full impact really hit me until later, but that moment I can still remember when I was sitting in the car and listening to the radio for some time, and thinking about the two young men who were with us and what would it mean for them.
I remember being on my hands and knees doing some homework, and the radio was on. I think we were listening to the Philharmonic Orchestra, and then came this, we interrupt this program to make a special announcement. And that's when the announcers told about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that was about 1:30, maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon of a Sunday. And I think everybody realized at once that this was going to change everything.
It was a so-called sea change, I think, for everyone, particularly if you were of military age, draft age, and you began to think, if not very profoundly, you began to think about it.
While the newspapers and newsreels were urging people to sign up for the military, many Quakers could look around them to find examples to sustain the peace initiative.
I'll go back to World War I because my father was a conscientious objector in a war where there wasn't any such thing. The law didn't allow for that or didn't recognize it in any way. And so he was drafted and went to Fort Dix, and he and a small group decided they wouldn't go along with everything and didn't cooperate. And so they were ostracized and kind of isolated, and they were harassed a bit. Finally, the Army gave up on him, and he got a dishonorable discharge in the First World War. So I grew up with all that history.
My father said that the company, as you know, produces precision instruments. And I've always said that as long as it continued to make its regular products, I would feel easy as a Quaker to have the military buy products. But if the day ever came when we went into weaponry, I'd have a difficult decision to make, and that's now happened. We've been given a contract to produce a part of the Borden bomb site, which was a big step ahead in bombing accuracy in that time. And we're now in the weapons business. And I find it difficult as a Quaker to be part of that. And if I quit, our whole standard of living as a family is going to go way down. And therefore, I don't want to take action without consulting the family, in which we all said, do what you think is right. And the next day, he quit cold. Took a $1 a year job with the Friends Service Committee. And I was really shaken by this, because his job was his life. He poured his whole life into this company. And yet, when it came up against the principle, he didn't hesitate. Bing, I'm quitting. And I said, now his faith means something to him. What's mine mean to me?
Well, I should say that must have been during the 1930s when I was at college. It's where I first encountered Quakers, and it probably had something to do with it, but I can't say. But I know then I began to take a pacifist position, but a troubled one. I wasn't content just to say, well, no war. I was interested in what else. So by the time the war actually broke out, I was, let's see, I wasn't yet a friend officially, but a confirmed pacifist. And it seemed awful, it seemed difficult, but I just felt I had to take that position. Dad and I clashed a great deal. He had no use whatever for my pacifist position. And it broke my heart to differ with him as much as I did. But it was late in life that we really made peace.
Well, I think it happened very slowly. What started, I was in high school when Mahatma Gandhi was very active in India, and I had gotten somehow or other interested in India and very interested in Mahatma Gandhi and the whole idea of his leading such a large country to independence through nonviolent ways.
Now, of course, many Quakers did not, as you're going to find out, did not become COs. They decided, for their own reasons, that they would go into the war. My own brother was in the Navy, for example. Most of my family members, I'm sure, wouldn't have taken the position I took, but they were all very supportive of me, you know. It was an individual position.
World War II, the Good War, was a particularly difficult time for Quakers. They were all pulled into the vortex of the war. There was no way to stand on the sidelines in this war. Guided by the light within, these young men found themselves on the decks of ships in combat, delivering medical supplies in China, and working in CO camps all across the States. Their stories are as varied as the places they served.
Quakers, through the American Friends Service Committee and the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonite Church, went together and formed, they were permitted by the government to form civilian public service camps. The idea was to do work of national importance. And we weren't paid anything, nothing really. When I went to a camp, my first camp was in North Carolina, where we did environmental work and firefighting. The men got paid $2.50 a month. Some of them couldn't even afford toothbrushes and toothpaste for that. So I was at this camp in North Carolina for, from August until the following May, and then I volunteered for firefighting in the West. And where I was, there wasn't many fires right around us. So then I volunteered for special service, it was called, and I volunteered for dairy farm work in Connecticut, because I was always interested in farming, having lived on this little farm. And so I was all by myself then, and it was outside of Hartford, Connecticut, and I was there. I was altogether in the service 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days. And we had no benefits. We didn't have any medical benefits. You had to buy your own clothes, own all that stuff. So that's the way it was. And of course, there was no GI Bill of Rights when we got out of this thing either.
I went in the Navy when I was 17, and this was the first ship that I was assigned to. And we had taken a tanker with aviation fuel over to the west coast of Africa. And so we had a 3-day running battle with 2 or more submarines. And we eventually sank all of them, and the last one was particularly difficult. And we had to contend with being strafed also. The airplane strafed us. And the end came on a night, and I remember that because I was on a damage control party on the deck, and the submarine was crippled and had to surface, and they fired star shells so that we could see what was going on. And in that they had a 6-inch gun and we had 5-inch, we opened up everything we had, the 40 millimeters and the 5-inch guns, on the target to keep the hatch down so that the gunners couldn't get out and get on that big gun and shoot at us. And we succeeded in doing that. And all men aboard that submarine perished. If they got out in the water, they drowned because we moved on and went on back to port, which we barely made.
What I'm going to tell you now, Laura, is something which I would have been severely punished, shall we say, utterly disgraced had I revealed to you until about 20 years ago, maybe, 20, 30 years, because we had to swear an oath that we would never, never divulge what we were doing. But what I was trained to do through a very tough program in Wimbledon was to listen to the voices of Germans who were supposed to be the commanders of E-boats, commanding the formation that he was responsible for, to attack our food ships, and to write down on an official Navy pad the commands that he was making. And while this was happening, the location of where he was broadcasting from was recorded by another set of friends that were trained in Morse code, whereas mine was in radio telephony. And we had the exam at the end of 3 weeks, and those of us that passed it were posted to various stations on the coast of England, mostly on the east coast, southeast coast, and on the south coast, to listen to the broadcasts. Most of it was twiddling one of those old radio sets all the time until one heard a carrier wave. You hear a sort of swishing noise. Once you hear the carrier wave up, you wait for the telephony, and then you're absolutely primed to listen as hard as you can and get down the German that is being transmitted to the E-boats that were raiding your ships.
My first assignment was to stack lumber in a local cooperative lumber yard. My next assignment was to go out with teams of men into abandoned pastures that had been unattended for years and had grown up with weed trees and bushes. We went in with machetes and chopped these to the ground in order to make a hospitable area for replanting desirable trees. And then after having done that, we went back and planted trees. Two men working as a team, going down the pasture, one with a mattock digging a slash in the ground, the other one sticking a small seedling in that and healing it in, and then going on 10 feet to do it again. We did that all day long, and reforested these old abandoned pastures. So I volunteered to become the camp farmer, and a friend of ours in the area had a farm about 5 miles from camp, and we were allowed to use a couple of acres for a camp garden, and I planted tomatoes and corn and potatoes and beans and so forth, and it turned out to be a quite lush growth that summer, and was much appreciated by the men in camp. There was a World War I conscientious objector in our area with whom we became acquainted. He lent me an Indian teepee that he had, and I lived right on the edge of the garden in a canvas Indian teepee. Cooked my own meals. I built a fire in the middle of the teepee. You know, it had flaps at the top which let the smoke out. And I had a sawed-off 55-gallon metal drum that I put there to build a fire in, and I had a big kettle, and I could heat water in there and sit in there and take a bath and look right out the doorway across the field. It was a beautiful experience and view.
No, I can't say that I liked the person I was. I was a good sailor. I could follow orders. I could do whatever I was told to do. And I think to be a good soldier, you have to sacrifice a lot of sensitivity. To be a good soldier or a Marine, that you have to be able to do what you're told to do. For example, we had some green men when we went to the Pacific, and the first time we were going in combat, the petty officer on the lower level, there are 2 levels in the fire room. I was one of the senior petty officers there, look at 19. And he said to me, he said, "These fellows are pretty antsy down here. I don't know whether they're going to bolt or not." He said, you have a pipe wrench there. And he said, anyone comes up that ladder, you'd have planted it in the top of his head. Well, that's an order. That's what I would have done. I would have killed one of the guys I worked with. But the integrity of the ship comes first. And that's what I would have had to do. And I would have done it. Thank goodness they didn't bolt. So that's a kind of conditioning that you have to be a good soldier.
I think we did some good things out in China. We were the only civilian distribution system for medical supplies in West China. We ran several convoys up into the communist areas where Mao and Zhou Enlai and the rest of them were up in Hunan province, because there was a united front between the Chiang Kai-shek Kuomintang government, who were our allies in the Second World War, and the communists, who had been fighting each other, and of course would again as soon as the war stopped. But during the war, they called off the Civil War, and so we sent 2 teams up there. And that was interesting because it led to the Chinese are great on ceremonies and banquets and things like that, and the American Friends Service Committee got a banner as a result of that Bronson Clark, who was in China and later chairman of the AFSC, went back to China during the Cold War, and with this banner, and they rolled out the red carpet. I mean, he had a great time.
And that is that after a while, this tension begins to get to you, and you begin to think, well, okay, I survived today, but I may not tomorrow, or I may not the next hour, And after a while, a number of us began to think anything to bring an end to it, whatever may come. You begin to be a little careless about the things that you do, because you think, well, fatalistic. I may or may not get hit. It depends upon what bullet or what shell has my number on it. So when I got hit, I was trying to rescue a person across a little alleyway from me who had been hit by a machine gunner, bullets from a machine gunner. So I put a white handkerchief on the end of a stick and waved it outside the doorway of the building where I was as an indication that stop firing. And then I stepped outside and pointed to the red cross on my arm, and then to avoid any suspicion, I started to walk across rather than run, and I got halfway across and he opened up on me. And so I fortunately spun around either through the impact of the one bullet that hit me. They were zipping all around me. I could humming like bees. I got back to where I'd come from, and I was really hit by only one bullet, and that smashed the bones of my forearm, left forearm. And I never got to the poor guy who was lying on the other side, so I don't know what happened to him.
And I remember dating a young man who was conflicted. He didn't know what to do, and we talked about it at length, and he read a great deal, and he searched inward for answers. And I knew that he would probably go toward the conscience objector stance, which he did. He became a CO. A group of young men who were conscience objectors were working in Gatlinburg. I don't know whether they were in forestry or just what their job was, but they were going from the camp to where they had been working. And it was on the road that group stopped and started beating up on, and beat up one quite badly.
It was a real trial because the Quaker camps had everybody and their uncle in them, and they had people who were third-grade education, people who were Pulitzer Prize winners, we had lawyers, we had dancers, we had engineers, everybody. It was just and fundamentalists, every religious group you ever heard of in your life, and to try to make that group work together and work with the government people was extremely testing. I mean, it's where I learned an awful lot about getting along with all types of people. So, but it was a wonderful experience for me, and so I really grew up a lot in that period.
One thing that I would not give up for anything was being thrown in with a bunch of people I never would have had the opportunity to associate with otherwise. It was an egalitarian army. We were all in there together. And I met and became friends with and helped and was helped by that 90% of America that I would not have associated with otherwise. When the chips are down, from all walks of life, people are really wonderful. And I can be friendly with anybody. I don't have any feelings of snobbishness or and I like that. I'm glad that I had that experience, because I can hobnob with anybody. When the war was over and we were discharged, I would say there were no brass bands or anything like that. Most of us put our duffel bags over our shoulder, and with our discharge papers, took the train or the bus or whatever form of transportation was available, and came home. And that was it. And then we discovered that nobody really wanted to talk about the war. And so we kept our mouths shut and decided we'd do our best to get back and finish our lives as civilians.
After the war ended, the service did not. While many combat vets went home to the GI Bill and college, many Quaker pacifists went on to service in Europe and Asia. Their work after the war helped millions of people to rebuild their shattered lives and homes, and may have gone a long way to avoid future wars.
Well, there's no doubt that those 2 years in Europe were the most important 2 years of my life. I had learned a lot. I'd grown up a lot in alternative service, but the exposure to, by the time I got to Europe, the armies weren't marching, the bombs weren't falling, but the wreckage was there. Worst of all, which never, it was a misery. People were cold and hungry and bereaved and homeless and wandering in refugee camps. And I mean, the conditions of life were just absolutely unspeakable. And nobody could have been part of that unbelievable situation in Europe in the wake of the war without being profoundly shaken by it. And I came home after 6 years, 4 in alternative service and 2 in Europe, saying I have to spend the rest of my life trying to prevent it from happening again. And I never had any question but what, for me, this was the right thing for me to do.
We had a program in Italy, in southern Italy, in the mountainous regions, which were very poor, poverty-stricken areas, and it was awfully hard to scratch a living out of the mountainous soil. And half or more of the people there were illiterate. It was a very cold early spring day, and in the evening, around 6 or 7 o'clock, a couple of dozen young men, like Alex sitting here, came into the center, and they were part of the literacy training program. There were several small tables, like a card table, in the room with a chair on each side of the 4 chairs at each table. And that evening, their exercise was to discuss this question: should man surrender in the face of adversity? And there's one of them that I will never forget, and I haven't thought about this for a while, and I'll see if I can remember it right now. Man should never surrender in the face of adversity, even though we know more suffering in our lives than good, even though we know more bad in our lives than good, if not for our sake, for the sake of our children, so that the good that is in the world can be accomplished. Now, even if you don't have any optimism about how a devastated country could climb out of this wartime experience, you hear something like that from the people who endured that experience, at least you have hope.
Then this town where I was sent to be the bookkeeper, all the roofs of all the houses had been destroyed in the war. Just total devastation.
It was dangerous, and it was arduous on the road. The trucks were breaking down all the time because they didn't have many spare parts. They were all flown over the hump and trickle. And so yeah, the Chinese were wonderful at adapting. They have a word, mama hoo hoo, which means literally doesn't make any sense, horse, horse, tiger, tiger. But what it means is you can sort of fix it, mama who, it'll get by, you can wrap string around it, tie it with wire or something, and it'll go. It's mama hoo. So a lot of the road work was that kind of thing, making do. Tires were repaired with pieces of rubber bolted around them, and made sort of a thump when you went. But so it was rough, but it was romantic too in a way, and exciting. We were a group trying to do a good thing together.
See, part of China was controlled by the nationalists and part by the communists. And we very deliberately had a clinic in Nanking which was nationalist controlled, and to sort of balance the mobile medical team that was with the communists who lived in the caves in Yunnan province. That was one of the principles of the Quaker work there, that we were not taking sides politically. And so we could work with both, and there's a reason that our group was not thrown out with when the communists did take over the whole country, the way the missionaries were thrown out, because mostly they had taken sides with the nationalists, and so they, in effect, were enemies of the communists and were thrown out. But we continued to operate after the communists took over for most of a year. But then the communists would say, you know, it's sort of embarrassing for you to run a school or a hospital that we really should be doing. Would you mind if we took these over? And they were very polite about that, and obviously we left it for them.
All of these conferences that we had every few months were difficult. As I look back, the one in Amsterdam was one of the toughest, because the kids who were there, most all of them in their 20s virtually, were absolutely exhausted, and they were stressed out. They worked 7 days a week. Their supplies were just a drop of what was really needed. Their trucks weren't running because they couldn't get spare parts, or they had too many flat tires. There were frictions within the group. It just looked like we just had insurmountable problems. It was very, very gloomy. And we were trying to struggle through this and look ahead as to what we should be doing in the next year. And it was the last day of a 4-day meeting, and all of a sudden this Dutch Quaker comes running into the room holding up a newspaper, and there's a headline across the paper that said, "Quakers win Nobel Peace Prize, honored for relief services." And of course we were absolutely stuck, absolutely dumb, and everybody just stopped talking, and we just had a spontaneous quiet meeting for worship. I mean, people were in tears, and I can remember my own feeling of just overwhelming gratitude for the wonderful faithfulness of these kids. And nobody said anything at all for probably 10 minutes, when finally one young American was working in Italy, WWII, stood up and said, "All I can say is a little love goes a long way." And that's lived with me for 50 years.
The Vietnam conflict was a very different war. Not a good war, it was universally opposed by most Quakers, even those who served in combat in World War II. Thousands of Quakers fought the draft and spoke out for peace. Their goal was peace, but their involvement was not passive.
All of us in that generation grew up believing that the United States government was righteous. You know, that we were, that the words of the Declaration of Independence and the words of the Constitution was what we were about. And so it was shocking to all of us, I think, to discover But that's not what our government was about over there at all.
We were reading the names of the war dead on the Capitol steps in Washington at the U.S. Capitol, because again we were realizing that a lot of people, the propaganda for the government was basically to minimize the cost to the U.S. of this, and to maximize the presumed benefits of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the freedom for the Vietnamese that we were bringing and so on, which was mostly outright lies. And so we thought, well, one thing we could do to remind the U.S. public of, or maybe to make them aware for the first time of how costly this is, would be to read the names of U.S. Soldiers who'd been killed in Vietnam. And so we didn't have access to Vietnamese names until later. Then we did it again with Vietnamese names, but at that point all we had access to through the Pentagon was the names of U.S. service people who had been killed. So what we did was we just took turns. At first it was very small demonstrations, like a dozen or 15 people would stand on the steps of the Pentagon and read names for as long as we were allowed to. At that time there was an ordinance that said that we didn't have a right to stand on the Capitol steps to demonstrate. And so the police would only let us read names for so long before they would arrest us. And then the very next week, we'd come back again. I think it was every Wednesday we would do this. And as the Wednesdays went by, more and more people joined us. And then U.S. Congress people started coming out and reading names with us. They would not be arrested, so we'd all be arrested, but they had congressional immunity. And they would say to the police officers, "Arrest me too, officer. If you're arresting these Quakers, you can arrest me too." But the police, of course, would always avoid arresting the growing number of U.S. Congress people, including Shirley Chisholm and some wonderful people.
Steve Carey, whom you're going to interview later, was arrested. And what I did, he's a member of our monthly meeting, Germantown monthly meeting, and I admired him very much. Not just for that, but for a number of things he had done in his life. And I decided that because I didn't want to go to prison because of the children, I felt my place was at home, that what I would do was fast during the whole time that he was in jail. Well, fortunately, it wasn't too long. I think he was in jail a little more than a week. If I remember right, but you can ask him, though he's probably been in jail more than once.
Seeing the results of American bombing in some of the provincial hospitals, and keenly aware of the fact that the USS New Jersey was sitting in the China Sea, as secure as you and I are sitting in this room, and lobbing 500-pound shells, rice paddies, I found it was obscene, absolutely obscene. And I hadn't planned to commit civil disobedience, but I went up to Leonardo, New Jersey, which is where there was a demonstration against the war on the beach there, because it was a Navy loading area. There was a great long quay that went out, and those big naval supply ships were being loaded with bombs. So I left the group and went over to a smaller group of about 20 young men who were going to make a civil disobedience, and I climbed up. The quay was about 25 feet above the beach, and there was this freight train full of bombs going out to the ships at the end of the pier. It was about 200 or 300 yards, and they were planning to climb up and lie on the tracks, and so I climbed up with them. And we got up to where we were about, the level of the quay was about at our waist, but every time we put our hands up to jump up on the quay, there was a squad of Marines there who were there to keep us from doing that, and they would step on our fingers, and so we had to back off until the train come down pushing a tank car with a water cannon. And of course the Marines had to step back to get out of the road. And at that point our intrepid leader jumped up on the track and lay down. And of course I wasn't terribly eager to do that, but having committed myself, I jumped down there on the track myself. and as did the other 15 or 20 guys we were lying on the track. And they turned the water cannon on, trying to squirt us off the quay, but we hung on to the ties of the train, and of course the Navy wasn't any more anxious to see martyrs than we were to be them, so the train stopped as it got to us. And a Marine, great big bruiser of a guy, he couldn't have been over 20, came and picked me up and by the back of my neck, and I was dripping wet, and he picked me up and picked my feet off out of the ground. I was hanging my feet down, and he says, I guess you think you're pretty goddamn smart, you son of a bitch. And I said, no, I don't think I'm smart. I'm sorry to have taken you away from your family on a Sunday afternoon. The guy was so surprised. He was as scared as I was. He was so surprised he dropped me like a sack of potatoes. And he reached down and he picked me up and brushed me off and pushed some mud aside and said, I think, sir, if you stand over there, they'll tell you what to do next. So I was hauled off for illegal trespass.
They asked me to give a speech, and I gave a speech about why others needed to join the sit-in. So my speech had great resonance, and suddenly, very quickly, the building became completely full, overwhelmingly full. Harvard, over a series, at the administration of the university, over a series of hours and reflection, decided that they would violate the principles of academic civil separation, which is traditional from the medieval ages about universities and local governments, and they would call in the Cambridge police to get rid of us. Okay, so you asked me how I was violated, okay? Well, when they came in, they clubbed us pretty badly, and we were thrown, of course, in jail, and we were subsequently convicted, and were convicted as trespassers, criminal trespassers. The university community as a whole rose up against the university for its action, and for the first time in the history of Harvard University, the university shut down in a general strike. And then from there on, we had a strike which went on for a while, and a good number of our demands were eventually met, and some of them rather immediately.
There was a tax imposed on the telephone just for the support of the war. But a lot of people, myself included, and my husband, refused to pay that telephone tax. The government got pretty upset about that, and they started trying to put liens on people in different ways. And what they tried to do with us was to take our car. So one time, I'm not sure who it was, whether it was the FBI or some other part of the government came, and they were going to tow away our car. And so I sat down, the car was in the driveway, and I sat down behind the car in the driveway, and I said, you know, if you want to move me, you can take the car. Well, they got a little discouraged about that, and they went away. So what we did then was just park the car in different places in the neighborhood until I think, you know, they got tired of. The more people started protesting and doing things like that, the more discouraged I think the government became, because they couldn't stay on top of it.
It was the height of the Vietnam War. It was 1968. I look back and everything happened in 1968. Good things, bad things. And one of the things that happened in 68 was that the caseload at every draft counseling center in the country doubled and tripled and quadrupled over a very short period because the draft calls went up and more people found out that they could get help. And one of the big successes, interestingly enough, was draft counseling. And it wasn't that there was quite a lot of people who refused to cooperate with selective service, but they weren't the ones who made it harder to work, made the draft unworkable. The ones who made the draft unworkable were the people who insisted on following their rights. And the system had been designed on the assumption that nobody would ever appeal a classification that they didn't like. And 100,000 people did in 1 month, and the system just broke down. And that was one of the things that brought about the end of the draft in this country, was that it was just becoming unworkable, and it was very unpopular.
While many were marching against the war at home, a small handful of Quakers set out to do something drastically different. Going against the wishes of the U.S. government, they set out to carry medical supplies to both northern and southern Vietnam. Raising their own money, they procured a boat and thousands of dollars of medical supplies and set out into the chaos of war with only their courage and goodwill to protect them.
Kind of then an ad hoc group called a Quaker Action Group, which had decided to send medical supplies to both North and South Vietnam, to send medical supplies for civilians that were injured in the war. And I was very interested in that, and so I started raising money at Swarthmore College to help out people. And the government considered this to be illegal. The government considered this to be trading with the enemy.
The public started to take a fresh look and get way more motivated, like, where is Vietnam anyway, that kind of thing. So it was possible then in that context to do what I thought of as kind of, what can I say, high visibility, dramatic, high risk actions that, even though it pitted us against U.S. policy, we thought that the moment had come for doing that in such a way that more doors would open of interest. And that paid off, because we did a series of 3 of those voyages over time. And each crew, when it came back, it would be in huge demand to speak at churches, and the media were covering us. Walter Cronkite was covering us, and Huntley Brinkley, and there was just a humongous amount of attention. Huge picture story in Look magazine, and an hour-long documentary on TV. And there was just a tremendous lot of interest. And it was partly, well, it was partly David and Goliath, you know, these tiny band of Quakers against the U.S. 7th Fleet, and so on. You know, so that was partly it. It was the imagery of David and Goliath, but also, I think it was that the cost of the war had been mounting, and so people were starting to wonder, is this really the right place?
What's this all about?
Yeah.
Basically, we would go around and speak to mostly small groups of people, friends meetings, college campuses, high school classes, whoever, church groups, whoever would hear us. So people, and mostly people, gave relatively small amounts of money. Every now and then there would be somebody who could give, you know, we had a couple people that gave $1,000, that was a lot of money.
The first voyage was the trickiest because of all this not knowingness. The ship left from Hiroshima, where it was based in Japan, to go to Hong Kong, load the medicines, and then go over to North Vietnam. And so that would mean going right through the 7th Fleet of the U.S. to do that, right past aircraft carriers and the whole works. Now, we didn't know if they would, for example, try to detain us at Hong Kong, but we realized the U.S. doesn't have legal authority to do that. So, but maybe they would try. Or maybe, on the other hand, they would wait till we got outside the 3-mile limit, outside Hong Kong in international waters, and then maybe they would seize our ship at that time. Or maybe they would let it go for a while, and then maybe there would be an accident, and the Phoenix would just bubble, glub, 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 and that would be that, lost at sea. Or maybe they would let it get through. We just had no way of knowing. And so I wasn't part of that first crew. I was on the second crew. The first crew, I was raising money for the first crew while they were on the sea, and they were very brave people because of this not knowing. What probably the most scary moment for them was at one point while they were out in the vicinity of the 7th Fleet in the South China Sea, a U.S. Navy plane came down at them like this, like you would if you were going to do a bombing run or a strafing run, and with that ear-splitting sound, and then pulled off just 100 yards above the mast. And they really thought, this is it. It's all over. And for some reason the pilot didn't do anything.
Ultimately what we said was, well, we're prepared to have people jump overboard, swim to shore, and try to get to the Vietnamese authorities who are making this decision, because we don't think it makes any sense that we've got supplies, medical supplies, humanitarian supplies for people, and you've got people that need them. And we had permission to do this when we left Hong Kong. Well, they then came on board and started to crank up our anchor, which is a very slow task. The Phoenix was not a high-tech boat at all. We thought it was kind of funny because cranking it up the anchor was one of our least favorite tasks. So we were glad to see somebody else have to sweat and do that. And we said, if you do this, we are going to nonviolently resist. We're prepared to have our crew members one at a time jump overboard, try to swim to shore, and try to talk to whoever's making this decision. And they pointed to the water and said, poisonous snakes in the water. It was a tropical country, that they probably were right. And we said, well, we'll take our chances. And so we ended up having 2 crew members jump overboard as they boarded our ship. And one of them, George Lakey, was a very experienced nonviolent peace activist. And I've always thought that, I actually don't know if I've ever checked this out with George, I've always thought that George knew this was a symbolic act. And so he didn't try real hard. He jumped overboard, and pretty soon they sent a couple of Navy swimmers, South Vietnamese swimmers, after him, and he didn't try to get away too hard, and they hauled him up on one of their ships. But the other guy, he wasn't into this symbolic thing. He just kept on swimming. And Harrison Butterworth was his name, and interestingly enough, he had had a tremendous case of seasickness, so we partly also just thought he wanted to get on shore and get off these darn boats. And he eventually actually did talk to a high-ranking Vietnamese general who basically said, look, your boat is famous for having gone to North Vietnam. We don't appreciate the fact that you helped out the North Vietnamese, even if it was aimed at civilians. And plus, you're trying to give half of your supplies to the Buddhist church and their peace movement people, and we're not really too much in favor of what they're doing either. So at that point, we did say, okay, we're still going to resist your efforts to not allow us to deliver these supplies, but we're not going to jump overboard anymore. I was scared. It would be foolish to say that I wasn't scared. Yeah, I didn't know, what I was in store for, or what was in store for me, but there's a way that, having made the decision to go to North Vietnam, which really was, we didn't know for sure whether we'd get bombed or not, either intentionally or not. Having made that decision, having made the decision to go to prison, really kind of set me on a path of saying, okay, I want to try to do what I think is right and try to change the unjust conditions that exist wherever I am. And so it didn't mean that I wasn't scared, but it meant that I was willing to confront those fears head on and not have the fear be the basis of my decision. So eventually, there were hard things that happened in jail. It wasn't an easy time to be separated from the woman that I had started to live with and who I eventually married. For that period of time was real hard. On the other hand, I also learned that I could live through hard experiences. And that was a real valuable lesson, that I could figure out how to cope with difficult situations that I, growing up, never would have guessed I would have had to cope with.
The 10th year high school reunion, after one of these Vietnam vets from my class had had a fair amount to drink, he came over and he said, George, it's time that I settle something with you. And I said, okay, tell me what's up. And he said, I just want you to know that while I was serving in Vietnam, I was home on a furlough once, and I was sitting down looking at TV news, and there I saw you being loaded into a paddy wagon for protesting the war, and you were being arrested. And I was so furious. I thought, how could my classmate George stab me in the back this way? How could he betray me? Here I am risking my life, and there's George stabbing me in the back. And he said, really, George, if you'd been there, I would have done my best to kill you. He said, I was just so furious. And I said, thank you for telling me that. I had no idea. That was so intense. So where are you now? And he said, well, no, I agree with you. I said, really? He said, yeah, now I know you were actually on our side. You were on our side. You didn't want us to be over there risking our lives, and certainly not to be killing other people.
When war is declared and people are rallying around the flag, many Americans have accused Quakers of being unpatriotic. Most of the people we spoke with didn't look in that light.
Yes, I think you very definitely can be patriotic and be a pacifist.
Well, I've thought some about this too. It's a very popular thing now to be patriotic and to fly the American flag on your car. And to sing the Star-Spangled Banner and recite the Pledge of Allegiance at ball games and things like that. I'm not identified with that. I'm not even proud to be an American. I am an American. It's a matter of fact that I am an American. There are some things that I can be proud of, but there are many things that I cannot be proud of. And patriotism of the popular kind that's sweeping the country at this time doesn't take some of this into consideration at all.
Well, I lived in Norway, for example. When I was 21, I lived there for a year. I was married to a Norwegian. And I fell in love with Norway. Norway's a fantastic country that's got itself so much more together than the U.S. And no poverty. Years ago they said it's ridiculous to have poverty. We don't have poverty. So they gave up poverty, they gave up slums, excellent medical care available to all, free university education, just in a zillion ways. Norway is just miles ahead of the U.S. And I had this great job as a music teacher in a high school. I was having a wonderful time organizing choirs and stuff. I was enjoying my wife's family, learning Norwegian, settling down. So, and of course her family was all saying, stay in Norway, settle down, settle down. And by the end of the year though, I realized I am so American. I really feel like my destiny as a human being is caught up with my Americanness. It's just a very strong identity. And I love my people. And somehow it was important to come back here and like work out my life in relation to this place. So I had this intense sense of community with the U.S. People. At the same time as I have very big alienation from the government, which pretends to represent my people.
While pacifism is still an important testimony to the Quakers' faith, it is a complex issue with nearly as many answers as there are people. Conformity is not nearly as important as thoughtfulness and doing what one feels is right.
War should be the last resort when everything else has been tried and failed. Then there is no alternative when the conflict, whatever it is so is such a threat to a nation or a group of people, and talk and all kinds of negotiation fail, then war is that final and dreadful alternative, in my opinion.
I do think also that pacifism isn't just about going or not going to war. I think it's how you behave, how you are one-on-one, how you are in your everyday life, how we treat each other, and whether we try to understand each other, try to get inside one another's feelings. I think that's part of it too.
I believe the basis of pacifism for me is that I want to have a positive relationship with everyone with whom I deal. That is, I don't want to have animosity, I don't want to have bad feelings toward individuals. I may not agree with them, but I think the basic concept of loving your brother is my basis for my pacifism. I do believe in, or I'm not against taking a life. In the case of society, if you have individuals who threaten society, that whether it be a domestic situation or an international one, that I have no compunctions about eliminating people either, killing them. And as I said earlier, that even William Penn saw this as a necessity, because the number 2 person in Pennsylvania was the colonel in charge of the militia.
Even though they're good wars, well, you know, William Penn once said, I was like this, there never was a good war or a bad peace. And I'm on the side of peace.
And maybe another way to answer that is I am not a pacifist, and still another way to say it is that I have great respect for pacifists. It's not them and us in that sense, but rather if someone is a pacifist and they are very, very sincere about it, I have great respect for that person. There are a handful of Quakers, and only a handful, who are pacifists in name only, whose very conduct belies that kind of conviction. In other words, they're kind of mean-spirited. And I think that mean-spirited people simply can't be pacifists.
I admired them because I thought it took a certain kind of courage. Just as going to war took a certain kind of courage, but there were two different kinds. And they were, many people ridiculed them, put them down, belittled them, and I thought that took enormous courage, a kind that I admire tremendously. And yet I couldn't help but think the reason that they are able to be COs is because other young men have gone and sacrificed their lives for this kind of freedom, including my husband, actually. And so I was sort of conflicted in a way, too, I guess, at that time.
Well, I think obviously I had Quakerism from the beginning, and yet this so-called good war was a tough one, because the sides and the issues seemed so stark and clear-cut when we were fighting the Nazis and all the horrible things they did. And yet I ultimately decided that whatever the cause and however justified the war might seem, I couldn't go out and kill somebody in that context. And I felt that really in the long run, some people had to stand up and say, whatever, we're not going to do this. It's madness. And until enough people, a lot of people, come to realize that, we're going to be slaughtering each other for the rest of history, as they have so far. And just to be on that side seemed important.